He fought over 100 battles. He commanded armies against the greatest empires of the ancient world, and he never lost, not once. History has produced brilliant generals: Caesar, Hannibal, Napoleon, Alexander. But there is one name that even professional military historians struggle to fully explain: a commander so tactically devastating, so relentlessly victorious, that his enemies came to believe he could not be killed by ordinary weapons. That the angels of God themselves rode beside him on the battlefield. His name was Khalid ibn al Walid, and he remains to this day the only general in recorded history who fought over 100 battles across 3 different military theaters, cavalry engagements, siege warfare, open field battles against overwhelming odds, and never once suffered a decisive defeat. This is not a legend. This is a documented historical fact. And it raises a question that military strategists have been asking for 14 centuries: how to understand Khalid ibn al Walid, you must first understand the world into which he was born, and why it seemed to make his destiny impossible. The year is approximately 585 AD. The Arabian Peninsula is not yet the birthplace of an empire. It is a vast, brutal landscape of competing tribes, blood feuds, and political fragmentation. The 2 superpowers of the known world, the Byzantine Empire to the northwest and the Sassanid Persian Empire to the northeast, regard the Arab tribes as nothing more than peripheral nuisances, useful occasionally as buffer states or mercenary forces, never as genuine threats. Into this world, in the holy city of Mecca, a boy is born to the Makhzum clan, one of the most prestigious and militarily powerful tribes of the Quraysh, the dominant Arab confederation. His father, al-Walid ibn al-Mughira, is a chieftain of considerable wealth and influence. The Makhzum clan was within Qurayshi society the tribe most associated with warfare and cavalry command. They produced warriors the way other clans produced merchants. From birth, Khalid inherits 2 things that will define everything that follows aristocratic status and a martial education of extraordinary depth. Arab tribal culture in this period was intensely, almost obsessively military. Every noble boy learned to ride before he learned to walk steadily. Horsemanship was not a skill, it was an identity. The young Khalid learned to ride in the manner of Arabian desert warriors, not the formal equestrian tradition of the Byzantine or Persian worlds, but something more fluid, more instinctive. A relationship with the horse that was almost symbiotic. A rider and animal moving together as a single responsive weapon. Beyond horsemanship, the Makhzum tradition meant Khalid was trained in the full spectrum of Arabian martial arts. The use of the lance, the curved sword, the javelin. He would have studied the tactics of tribal raiding and counter-raiding. The lightning strikes, the rapid withdrawals, the feints and misdirections that were the grammar of Arabian desert warfare. This tradition of fast-moving, unpredictable combat would later become one of his signature advantages against more conventionally organized armies that relied on set formations and predictable deployments. By the time he reaches his 20s, Khalid ibn al Walid has already become something his contemporaries struggle to categorize. He is not merely a good fighter. He is a tactical mind, a man who watches a battle unfold the way a master chess player watches a board 3 moves ahead of everyone else in the room. He understands terrain. He understands momentum. He understands with an almost frightening intuition exactly where an enemy formation will break before the enemy themselves knows. Can you imagine having that ability to look at 10,000 men arrayed against you and already see in your mind's eye the precise sequence of events that will unravel them. But, and this is the crucial irony of Khalid's story, the first time he uses this gift in battle at scale, he uses it against the very religion that will later make him immortal. The year is 625 AD, the Battle of Uhud. Muhammad has led a Muslim army out of Medina to meet a Quraysh force that includes Khalid ibn al Walid, fighting at this moment in history on the opposing side. The battlefield is the slopes of Mount Uhud, north of Medina. The Muslims number around 700 men. The Quraysh force is 3,000 strong. But the early Muslim fighters have a tactical advantage. Muhammad has placed 50 archers on a strategic hilltop called Aynayan, with explicit orders never to abandon their position, regardless of what happens below. Their job is to protect the Muslim left flank from exactly the kind of cavalry maneuver that Khalid is famous for. The battle begins well for the Muslims. Their central infantry pushes through the Qurayshi lines. The Quraysh cavalry led by Khalid repeatedly charges the Muslim flank, and each time the archers on the hill rain arrows down, driving the horsemen back. For a time, it seems the Muslim tactical plan is working perfectly. And then human nature intervenes. As the Quraysh center begins to break and retreat, the Muslim fighters surge forward in pursuit. They see the enemy fleeing. They see the abandoned enemy camp its wealth and supplies suddenly unguarded. Victory feels certain enough that 50 archers decide their orders no longer apply to a battle that is already won. All but a handful abandon the hill. It is the kind of tactical error that Khalid has been scanning for. He has been probing that hillside with his cavalry for the entire battle, not because he expected to break through, but because he was watching, waiting for exactly this moment. In an instant, he wheels his cavalry around the now exposed flank, a maneuver executed so fast, so precisely calibrated, to the exact second the hill emptied, that the Muslim archers barely have time to understand what is happening before Khalid's horsemen crash through the gap. The Muslim army surging forward in pursuit of a retreating enemy suddenly finds itself attacked from behind by the cavalry they thought they had neutralized. Panic replaces triumph. The formations that had been winning collapse. 70 of Muhammad's closest companions die. The Prophet himself is wounded, almost killed. Military historians study this maneuver today. It is textbook cavalry exploitation of a compromised flank. But the speed, the timing, the almost telepathic recognition of the precise moment the opportunity opened, that is Khalid. That is what he does. That is what he has always done. He fought against Islam at Uhud. He helped deliver one of early Islam's most painful military defeats. And then, in one of the most dramatic personal transformations in military history, he joined it. The exact reasons for Khalid's conversion to Islam in 627 or 628 AD remain a subject of historical discussion. He later said that he had begun to see signs of divine truth in the message of Muhammad. He described a growing conviction, not sudden but gradual, that the old Qurayshi way of life was ending and that something new and more profound was taking its place. Some historians suggest political calculation played a role as well. Khalid was sophisticated enough to recognize that the political winds of Arabia were shifting in ways that the Quraysh aristocracy refused to see. The story of his conversion is in itself remarkable. He reportedly traveled to Medina with Amr ibn al-As and Uthman ibn Talha, two other prominent men who chose the same moment to cross over. When they arrived, Muhammad received them warmly, but it was to Khalid that the Prophet directed his most significant words. "I have long known of your brilliance in warfare, Khalid," Muhammad said. I had hoped that God would direct that brilliance toward a higher purpose. Muhammad gave him a title that no one else in Islamic history would ever receive, Saif Allah, the Sword of God. It was not merely an honorific, it was a statement of intended function. And Khalid ibn al Walid would spend the remaining 30 years of his life proving it to be the most accurate description ever given to a human being on a battlefield. Within months, he would begin demonstrating exactly what that title meant, and the world would never quite recover. His first major command under the Muslim banner came at the Battle of Muta in 629 AD, and it illustrated something essential about Khalid that goes beyond tactics. It revealed his relationship with catastrophe. A Muslim force of 3,000 men had marched north toward the Byzantine frontier sent by Muhammad on a diplomatic mission. The details of what went wrong are disputed by historians, but the outcome is not. Instead of a diplomatic exchange, they encountered a Byzantine military force that ancient sources estimate at 100,000 soldiers. The actual number was almost certainly lower. The Byzantines likely had between 10 and 30,000 men supported by allied Arab tribes. But even at the most conservative estimate, the Muslim force was massively outnumbered. The three commanders Muhammad had appointed went into battle in order of designation. Zayd ibn Haritha, the first commander, was killed fighting. Jafar ibn Abi Talib, who replaced him, fought until both his arms were cut off, holding the battle standard between his stumps until he fell. Abdullah ibn Rawaha, the third commander, took up the flag and was killed within hours. 3 commanders dead. The Muslim army was in free fall. Men were looking for any direction that was not forward. The entire force was on the edge of catastrophic disintegration. This is the moment of maximum chaos, maximum terror, maximum disorder, when Khalid ibn al Walid steps into command. What he does next is studied in military academies to this day. With an enemy force already engaging from the front, Khalid does not try to win. He tries to survive, and he does it with such tactical sophistication that it looks like genius rather than desperate improvisation. He reorganizes the formations in contact with the enemy. He shuffles his cavalry to present fresh units where the Byzantines expect exhausted ones, creating the impression of reserves he does not actually have. He cycles units in and out of direct engagement, giving each a brief recovery period before committing them again. He creates the psychological impression for the Byzantine commanders watching the battle unfold of a force that is much larger and far more organized than the shattered remnant he is actually commanding. Most critically, he controls the pace of the disengagement. A rout is contagious. One unit running can collapse an entire army within minutes. What Khalid achieves at Muta is a fighting withdrawal so disciplined that the Byzantines actually hesitate, convinced they are being deliberately lured into an ambush. They pursue cautiously, and in that caution, Khalid extracts nearly his entire force. He returns to Medina with the army intact. 3,000 men battered and grieving 3 beloved commanders, but alive and together as a fighting force. Muhammad reportedly said, God chose Khalid as a sword among his swords. But this was only the beginning. Because now, in the years that followed, Khalid ibn al Walid would have something he had never had before, an entire civilization at his back, and he would use it to shake the world. The year 632 AD. The Prophet Muhammad has died. The Muslim community is in its most profound crisis since its founding. Across Arabia, tribes that had pledged allegiance to Islam under the Prophet's personal authority now declare that allegiance void. They refuse to pay the religious tax, and some proclaim entirely new prophets. The most dangerous of these false prophets, Musaylama, who commands the powerful Banu Hanifa tribe, controls a force historians estimate at 40,000 warriors. This is the Ridda Wars, the Wars of Apostasy. Caliph Abu Bakr, the first successor to Muhammad, makes a decision that historians still debate rather than negotiate with the rebels or accept a modified form of submission. He refuses any compromise. Islam will either survive intact or it will not survive at all, and he entrusts Khalid ibn al Walid with the military campaign to enforce that decision. What follows is a masterclass in the application of tempo as a weapon. Khalid does not allow his enemies time to coordinate, to communicate, or to reinforce each other. He moves across Arabia at a speed that leaves tribal confederations unable to assemble before he is already fighting and defeating the component parts. He fights 11 major engagements in less than a year, an operational pace that would be considered aggressive by modern standards with mechanized transport, let alone 7th century logistics. At the Battle of Buzaka, he defeats one rebel coalition. At Zafar, another. Each victory generates momentum, former rebels rethinking their position, watching Khalid advance and asking themselves whether their new prophet is truly worth dying for. And then comes Aqaba, the decisive engagement of the Ridda Wars. Musaylama and his Banu Hanifa warriors, the backbone of the Arabian apostasy, have assembled perhaps 40,000 fighters. It is the largest force Khalid has faced on the peninsula, and they fight with the fervor of true believers because they genuinely believe their prophet is the equal of Muhammad. What Khalid does at Aqaba is a masterpiece of psychological and tactical manipulation. He begins by advancing directly, drawing Musaylama's forces out into open engagement. Then, at a moment precisely calculated to maximize the psychological effect, his central force executes a feigned retreat. Not a rout, a careful, controlled withdrawal that invites pursuit. The Banu Hanifa, sensing victory, surge forward. Their formation, tight and disciplined in defense, opens and extends in the excitement of pursuit. The moment the formation opens, Khalid turns his cavalry. The flanks that had been holding back swing inward. The Banu Hanifa find themselves in the trap. Musaylama himself is killed in the fighting, and with his death, the last serious challenge to Muslim unity in Arabia collapses. By the end of the Ridda Wars, Arabia is unified under the Caliphate. The crisis that might have ended the Muslim experiment before it truly began has been resolved, and Khalid has not lost a single engagement. He is barely warming up. In 633 AD, Khalid receives orders that would paralyze most commanders with their sheer ambition. Invade the Sassanid Persian Empire, the superpower that had dominated Mesopotamia for 4 centuries and had recently fought the Byzantine Empire to a standstill across an entire generation of brutal warfare. The Persians are not a declining power. They field heavily armored cataphract cavalry riders and horses, both encased in iron scale armor that can break most infantry formations through sheer weight. They deploy war elephants whose psychological impact alone could shatter inexperienced troops. Their commanders are professional soldiers trained in centuries of accumulated tactical doctrine. Against this, Khalid arrives with perhaps 18,000 men, many of them tribal warriors whose primary military experience has been the fluid, fast-moving warfare of Arabian desert raiding. And yet, at the Battle of Chains, named because the Persian commander chained his infantry together to prevent retreat, Khalid breaks through a formation that was literally designed to be unbreakable. At Ulais, he defeats a Persian relief force in a battle so ferocious that the nearby river runs red with blood, earning it the name the Battle of Blood River. At Walaja, he executes a double envelopment, a pincer movement, in which two wings of his cavalry sweep simultaneously around both flanks of the Persian line that military historians compare to Hannibal's masterpiece at Cannae, but accomplished with fewer troops in more difficult terrain, and against an enemy that should have had the tactical advantage. He captures the approaches to Ctesiphon, the Persian imperial capital. He expands Muslim control across southern Mesopotamia in a campaign of relentless offensive momentum that the Persians, despite their overwhelming material advantages, cannot find a way to stop. And then, at the absolute apex of his Persian campaign, when Mesopotamia is nearly secured, and his greatest triumph seems within reach, Khalid receives an order that would have broken most commanders' spirit entirely. He is told to leave. Immediately. The Syrian front needs him more. What he does next is in some ways even more extraordinary than his battlefield victories. Khalid ibn al Walid abandons his campaign at the moment of maximum strategic opportunity, hands command to a subordinate, and marches his force 1,200 miles across the Syrian desert in summer, with temperatures that would kill men who weren't used to it, at a speed so extraordinary that historians still debate how he accomplished it. He chooses a route through terrain that no army had successfully navigated at speed. He crosses it anyway. He arrives on the Byzantine frontier, having lost almost none of his men. The Byzantines, who thought they had weeks to prepare, wake up to find Khalid's army already there. What followed was the opening move in the most consequential military campaign Khalid would ever fight. The Byzantine Empire was the superpower of the Western world, the legitimate heir of Rome, the guardian of Greek civilization, the defender of Christian orthodoxy. Constantinople was the greatest city on earth. The Byzantine army was professional, experienced, and commanded by generals who had spent decades fighting the equally formidable Sassanid Persians. They were not ready for Khalid. He defeated the Byzantine force at Ajnadain in 634 AD battle that opened the route into Syria proper. He defeated another Byzantine army at Marj Rahit, exploiting the same principles of rapid movement and unexpected axis of attack that he had refined across a decade of continuous warfare. He swept through Syria like a blade through silk, each city falling faster than the Byzantine command structure could coordinate a response. And then came the battle that would define his legacy forever. The Battle of Yarmouk, August 636 AD. Emperor Heraclius, the greatest Byzantine ruler of his era, the man who had personally reversed 4 centuries of Persian pressure and driven the Sassanids to near collapse, assembled the largest army the Byzantine Empire could field in a single generation. Ancient sources give figures of 100,000 to 400,000. Modern historians estimate between 80,000 and 150,000, still massively superior to the Muslim force of 25,000 to 40,000 that Khalid commanded. This is the battle everything has been building toward. The battle that will determine whether the Muslim presence in the Levant survives or is crushed. The battle between the greatest empire in the Western world and a force that on paper should not exist as a genuine military rival to it. What happens over 6 days at the Yarmuk River Gorge is breathtaking in its tactical complexity. Khalid does not fight a single pitched battle. He fights a series of interlocking engagements, each one feeding into the next. He shifts his mobile reserve, a force he keeps uncommitted, specifically for this purpose, to crisis points across the 6-mile front, with a speed that leaves Byzantine commanders unable to press any single advantage to its conclusion. Every time the Byzantines break through somewhere on the line, Khalid is already moving fresh troops to seal the gap before the breakthrough can widen. He employs feigned retreats, his signature maneuver used at Uhud, at Aqraba in the Persian campaign, to draw Byzantine cavalry out of supporting range of the infantry. He uses the terrain of the Yarmouk gorge to create a situation where the Byzantine right flank has nowhere to maneuver, neutralizing the numerical advantage that should have decided the battle before noon on the first day. On the sixth day, a sandstorm sweeps across the battlefield from the east. The Byzantines facing into the storm are blinded. Their carefully maintained formation cohesion, the thing that had allowed them to resist for 5 days, despite Khalid's relentless pressure, shatters in the howling chaos of driven sand. Khalid had kept his cavalry reserve intact for exactly this moment, or a moment when the Byzantine structure would crack. He drives his cavalry through a gap in the Byzantine left flank. Then another. The line doesn't bend, it shatters. Byzantine units that had fought with discipline for 5 days suddenly find themselves cut off, surrounded, pushed toward the gorge behind them. Thousands fall into the ravine. The Byzantine army, the finest military force the Western world could assemble, ceases to exist as a fighting force in a single afternoon. The Battle of Yarmouk effectively ends Byzantine control of the Levant. Within years, Jerusalem falls, Syria falls, Egypt falls. The eastern provinces of the Roman world territories that Rome and Byzantium had held for 7 centuries are gone in a single generation. The geopolitical map of the entire Middle East is redrawn. The cultural and religious composition of the Levant, North Africa, and Mesopotamia shifts irreversibly. Khalid ibn al Walid, commanding a force outnumbered by a ratio of 3 or 4 to 1, had shattered the army of the world's most powerful empire. He had never lost a battle. He would never lose one. But here's where the story turns into something more than military biography. Here is where it becomes genuinely human and genuinely strange. At the height of his power, at the moment when Khalid ibn al Walid is the most feared military commander on earth, when his name alone causes cities to open their gates before his army arrives, the new caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab removes him from command. The reasons are debated by historians. Some say Umar feared that the Muslim soldiers were beginning to attribute victories to Khalid rather than to God, that the commander's reputation was becoming a kind of cult of personality that threatened the theological unity of the community. Some say there were financial irregularities in Khalid's distribution of war spoils. Some say Umar simply did not trust a man who had once fought against Islam, that the memory of Uhud, of the 70 companions who died because of Khalid's cavalry maneuver, could never be fully erased, no matter how many subsequent victories he won in Islam's name. Whatever the reason, Khalid, the sword of God, the undefeated, the architect of an empire that would reshape half the world, was removed from supreme command and given a subordinate role under Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah. What is remarkable, what separates this moment from the kind of story that ends in rebellion, in civil war, in the general using his troops' loyalty to force reinstatement, is what Khalid did next. He accepted the decision. He served under commanders who were by any military measure his intellectual inferiors on the battlefield. And he served them loyally, completely and without visible resentment. He continued to fight. He continued to win. But now, as a subordinate, not a commander-in-chief. When asked how he felt about being removed from command after a lifetime of unbroken victory, Khalid reportedly said something that has been quoted by Islamic scholars ever since, "I fight for God, not for command." 7 words. And in those 7 words, perhaps the key to understanding everything else about him, the conversion, the loyalty, the acceptance of humiliation without rebellion. He died in Homs in 642. AD, a rare fate for a man who had spent 50 years on the battlefield. His last recorded words were reportedly not a farewell, not a final blessing, but a lament. He pointed to the scars covering his body, the wounds from 100 engagements, each one, a mark of a battle where he had stood where the fighting was thickest, and said that he had hoped to find a martyr's death on the field, that he had faced death 100 times, and it had refused to take him, and that now death had found him in a bed like a merchant or an old shepherd and denied him the ending he had sought his entire life. Even his regret was a warrior's regret. So what do we make of Khalid ibn al Walid 14 centuries later? His record is by any objective measure historically unprecedented. Military historians who have analyzed his campaigns point to several consistent elements that explain his unbroken record, an almost superhuman ability to read terrain and exploit it in real time, a preference for offensive action that consistently denied enemies the ability to choose their ground, the use of mobile cavalry reserves deployed at precise moments of enemy vulnerability, and a tactical flexibility, the willingness to abandon a plan the instant circumstances changed, that was extraordinarily rare in ancient and medieval warfare, where commanders typically committed to a formation and held it regardless of what the battle demanded. He also possessed something harder to quantify, an intuitive grasp of the psychological dimension of warfare. He understood that battles are won and lost in the minds of soldiers before they are won and lost on the field. His feigned retreats worked not merely because they created tactical opportunities, but because they created doubt in the minds of pursuing enemies. His rapid marches worked not merely because they positioned his forces favorably, but because they generated a reputation for appearing impossibly fast, so that enemy commanders began to factor in an almost supernatural quality of unpredictability when planning against him. He weaponized his own legend, but numbers and techniques only go so far as an explanation. There is something else in Khalid's record that resists pure tactical analysis. The crossing of the Syrian desert, the maintenance of unit cohesion through catastrophe at Muta, the ability to keep armies fighting and believing in victory through conditions outnumbered, exhausted, far from home, that would have caused most ancient forces to simply dissolve. These things speak to a quality of leadership that goes beyond tactical brilliance, a capacity to make men believe genuinely and completely that they cannot be defeated, that the cause is righteous, that the commander beside them has already seen the outcome, and the outcome is victory. Khalid ibn al Walid built empires, literally. The campaigns he commanded were instrumental in the creation of the Rashidun Caliphate, the first great Islamic state, which at its height stretched from the borders of India and Central Asia to the coast of North Africa. The geopolitical map of the Middle East, the cultural and religious composition of the Levant and Mesopotamia, the very nature of the world's second largest religion, all of these were shaped in ways impossible to fully trace by the battles that Khalid fought and won across 15 years of continuous campaigning. And he won them all in a profession defined by the inevitability of eventual defeat, because all armies lose eventually, because even the greatest generals suffer catastrophic reversals. Khalid ibn al Walid stands completely alone. 100 battles against Persian cataphracts and Byzantine legions and Arab tribal confederations and rebel armies in the desert, and not one defeat. Military historians sometimes ask a thought experiment: if you could take any general from history and place them in command of your army, who would you choose? Caesar, who was occasionally surprised and once nearly destroyed at Gergovia Wellington, who fought brilliantly but had never faced an army like Yarmuk Rommel, whose genius was undermined by the logistics? He could never fully solve Napoleon, whose military career ended in catastrophic overextension. The serious answer, the answer that emerges when you set aside famous names and look purely at the record, is a 7th century Arab warrior from Mecca who learned to fight in the dust of tribal Arabia, converted to a new faith in middle age, and then spent the remaining years of his life proving that his faith's God had chosen the right sword. The sword of God. Undefeated. Unrepeatable. There will never be another record like his. Not because no future general will be as brilliant, but because the conditions that forged Khalid ibn al Walid, the world that made him necessary, the cause that made him invincible, were a singular moment in history that will not come again. He stood at the hinge of the world, and he turned it. If this story changed how you think about greatness, about what one human being is truly capable of achieving in a single lifetime, subscribe to History of that day. Because history is full of names the world forgot, and it's time we remembered them.